Could the turmoil in Eastern Europe lead to food shortages here? Dr. Gustavo Oliveira is an assistant professor of global and international studies at the University of California, Irvine. He is joining us now live to break this down. Thanks for being here tonight. So Ukraine and Russia, they're both major producers of corn, wheat, barley, sunflower oil. It's something we haven't thought about a lot in covering this war, right? What does cutting off access mean for Europe and for the world more broadly?
That's true. As your correspondent said, they do represent a very large proportion of corn, wheat, barley, and especially even sunflower oil exports worldwide. Now, these might not be big into the US, but they do account for a very large proportion of imports into many countries in the Middle East, Africa, parts of Eastern Europe, and even some parts of Asia. Sunflower oil, for example, has been a substitute in China for soybean imports in this period of US-China trade wars. So these things do play a role. They're all interconnected.
And so how much of Ukraine's economy depends on agricultural exports? And what is happening now that in the Black Sea region, now that access has been cut off by the Russians?
Well, the Ukraine historically has been the breadbasket of Europe. The economy is more diverse than agriculture alone, but especially for their foreign reserves, agricultural exports are very important, and about 80% of them they're shipped through the Black Sea. The Black Sea region as a whole is an agricultural producer area, but we're talking not just about corn, wheat, barley, sunflower oil, but fertilizer, very importantly, as your correspondent pointed out, as well as oil and gas. All of that is shipped through that particular sea route, and overland transportation costs, trucks are just not competitive. It's not going to be cost valuable. It's prohibitive, too costly to get these exports, both of fertilizer and of those agricultural crops, to the Middle East, to the US, to Asia. It really is a matter of a major choke point in global agricultural and fertilizer markets.
In other ways, I was reading some of what you read and some of what you wrote, rather, and in other ways, it could actually benefit the U.S., right? Because there's less competition.
Well, it's always a mixed bag. So on the short term, U.S. corn exporters might see a short-term windfall. China, for example, might start to have to buy more corn from the U.S., which the trade war had, tempered a bit, because until the South American corn crops come on the market later in the year, there's no one else in the game. And U.S.-based trading companies, we're talking about Cargill, ADM, the big ones like that, even if they lose money on the Black Sea region, they will more than make up for it for their higher profits with the higher prices elsewhere they operate. But while this might be in the short term good for U.S. corn farmers and some U.S. Trading companies, as your correspondent pointed out, we are seeing this, contributing to higher inflation, higher food prices worldwide, and this is affecting U.S. consumers and U.S. farmers who are having to pay for that fertilizer this year and who are going to really suffer as these higher production costs start to bite into their margins later in this year and in the next, because this windfall that we might have in the short term is not going to make up for the significantly higher costs that we will be seeing, not just in the US, but Brazil, Argentina, any major agricultural producer is going to be suffering quite higher production costs in this coming year or more, depending how the conflict continues.
So before I let you go, you're talking about the long term. What are the long-term impacts and what are the solutions?
Well, this is not really just about the war. Much like with pandemic and food supply chain disruptions, this extremely vulnerable global food system that we have is dependent on cash crop production, on very concentrated trading channels, on very concentrated companies, and on very concentrated choke points. A solution would be finding ways to reduce our reliance on synthetic chemical fertilizers by building more organic matter in the soil, adopting more agroecological farming practices that will free up farmers from having to purchase their fertilizer, and similarly those countries that are really going to suffer, it's not the U.S. consumer that's going to suffer the most. It's consumers in the Middle East, in poor countries in Africa, in poor countries in Asia. Those countries, the solutions that really need to be seen on a global scale is to rebuild publicly funded, ever normal granaries so that each country is able to have a buffer, is able to maintain food prices low enough that we don't see a crisis like with the Arab Spring about 10 years ago when food prices had spiked before. This is a structural long-term issue. We have to reverse some of those WTO agreements that dismantled a lot of the public funding, support networks, safety nets that were very beneficial both for U.S. consumers and U.S. farmers, and even more so for consumers and producers in poorer countries in the world. So we're talking about changing agricultural production practices to be more sustainable, and we're talking about changing global food systems to be much more decentralized, publicly funded. It's a big deal that we're talking about here.
Yeah, there's so many tentacles extending into every facet of life and society. Dr. Oliveira, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.